The dust settled in the ruts of the road, a fine, pale powder that clung to his worn boots. Behind him, the town of Redemption was a collection of hard lines and sharp angles, its newly raised gate a stark, final punctuation to 60 years of his life. Abner did not look back. To turn his head would be to grant them a victory he was not prepared to concede. The wind, a dry and ceaseless thing on this high prairie, tugged at the collar of his coat and whispered of the coming autumn. It was a language he understood better than the clipped, decisive tones of Mr. Hemlock, the merchant who now ran the town council and whose pronouncements carried the weight of law. "A man of your age is a burden in lean times, Abner," Hemlock had said, his face impassive, his words cushioned by a feigned concern that was more insulting than open contempt. "We must all be productive. Your contributions are behind you," and so, with a canvas sack containing a hammer, 3 steel chisels, a tin plate, a small bag of cornmeal, and the woolen blanket from his cot, he was escorted to the edge of the settlement and turned out. He was a piece of worn-out machinery being discarded. He felt the weight of their judgment, a cold pressure in his chest, but it was overshadowed by a more immediate and practical gravity. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of bruised orange and violet. He needed shelter, not just for this night, but for all the nights to come. His gaze lifted from the dusty ground and scanned the horizon. To the east, the prairie stretched into an unending sea of brown grass. But to the north, a different shape broke the monotony. A series of limestone bluffs rose from the earth, their pale faces catching the last of the day's light. They looked like ancient bones, scoured clean by the wind. A place of permanence, a place of substance. A quiet, unyielding dignity settled over him, pushing back the cold. They had cast him out, but they did not own the land. They did not own the stone. He adjusted the sack on his shoulder, the metal tools clinking softly, a sound of purpose in the vast silence. He turned his face to the north and began to walk. The journey to the bluffs took the remainder of the day and stretched into the gray light of the next morning. It was a walk measured not in miles but in the changing texture of the ground beneath his feet, from the soft dust of the road to the hard-packed earth of the open plain, and finally to the loose, sharp scree at the base of the cliffs. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion that age had taught him, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the land. He saw where water had run in the last rain, noted the gnarled, deep-rooted shrubs that survived the punishing sun, and marked the flight of a hawk circling on a thermal. These were the details that mattered now, the only truths he could rely on. He spent the first night huddled in the shallow lee of a boulder, the blanket pulled tight around him, the stars a cold, indifferent scatter of diamonds overhead. He ate a handful of dry cornmeal, chewing it slowly until it became a paste in his mouth, washing it down with a careful sip of water from his canteen. The cold seeped into his bones, a deep, invasive chill that made his joints ache with a familiar fire. But with the first light, he was moving again, the stiffness in his limbs a complaint he refused to acknowledge. When he finally reached the base of the main bluff, he ran a calloused hand over its surface. The limestone was cool and slightly rough, a tapestry of grays and creams. He tapped it with his knuckles, listening to the solid, resonant sound. It was not granite, unforgiving and impossible, but a softer, more yielding stone. Manageable. He walked the length of the cliff face for hours, his gaze analytical, searching. He was not looking for a cave, for nature to provide a ready-made solution. He was looking for a starting point, a flaw, a place where he could impose his will upon the rock. He found it near midday, a shallow alcove no deeper than a man's arm, but sheltered from the prevailing wind and situated high enough to be safe from flash floods. This would be the place. He unshouldered his sack, the sound of the heavy canvas dropping to the ground a declaration. He took out the heaviest of his chisels and the hammer. He felt the heft of the tools in his hands, the familiar balance of them a comfort. He placed the sharp edge of the steel against the rock and, with a steady, practiced motion, struck the first blow. The sound was sharp, definitive, a crack that broke the immense silence of the prairie. The hammer blow sent a stinging vibration up his arm, a shock that was both painful and profoundly satisfying. A small chip of pale limestone, no bigger than his thumbnail, broke free and fell to the ground. He stared at it for a moment, then set the chisel again. The work was a slow, brutal rhythm. Strike, turn, strike. The world narrowed to the few inches of rock in front of him, the point of his chisel, and the arc of his hammer. Dust, fine as flour, filled the air, coating his eyebrows and settling in the creases of his face. Sweat traced clean paths through the grime on his skin. He did not think of the town. He did not think of Hemlock's dismissive face. He thought only of the stone. He learned its language, the way it fractured along hidden seams, the way a harder, crystalline vein would resist him, forcing him to change his angle of attack. His shoulders burned, and the muscles in his back tightened into knots of fire. He worked until the sun was directly overhead, then rested for a short while in the sliver of shade he had created, eating another dry, measured portion of his cornmeal. The water in his canteen tasted of warm metal, but it was life. Then he was back at the rock face. Strike, turn, strike. By the time the sun began to dip low again, casting his long, distorted shadow against the cliff, the alcove was perhaps 6 inches deeper. It was a laughable amount of progress against the sheer mass of the bluff, a mouse gnawing at a mountain. But it was his. It was a space that had not existed that morning, a cavity in the world made by his own hand. He cleaned his tools with a piece of rag, his movements precise and careful. These were his partners in this endeavor. Their well-being was his own. That night, sleeping in the slightly deepened hollow, the rock at his back seemed to hold a faint warmth from the day's sun. It was a different kind of shelter, not of wood and nail, but of substance, of the earth itself. He could feel its immense, patient strength, and he drew a measure of it into himself. Days bled into weeks. The sun rose, he worked. The sun set, he slept. His life became a cycle of labor, rest, and sustenance. The pile of limestone rubble at the base of the cliff grew steadily, a testament to his persistence. He had deepened the initial cavity into a space large enough to crouch in, then to kneel in. The constant problem was the removal of the debris. At first, he could simply scrape it out with his hands and the shovel head he'd lashed to a sturdy branch. But as the hole deepened, it became a significant chore. He devised a system using his woolen blanket as a travois. He would pile the sharp-edged stones onto it, then drag the heavy load out into the open, his boots slipping on the loose scree. It was inefficient, back-breaking work, but it was a solution. He faced a new challenge when a vein of chert, hard as glass, bisected the limestone. His chisels, which had held their edge against the softer rock, now blunted and chipped against the stubborn intrusion. He spent the better part of 2 days patiently sharpening them on a flat, abrasive sandstone he found near a dry wash, his hands raw, his frustration a cold knot in his stomach. But he did not stop. He learned to work around the chert, to undercut it and break it out in larger, more brittle chunks. He was not conquering the stone. He was having a conversation with it, learning its weaknesses, respecting its strengths. One afternoon, a rider from the town passed in the distance, a small, dark figure on the horizon. The man paused, his horse stamping impatiently. Abner could feel the distant gaze on him, a look of pity or perhaps morbid curiosity. The rider shook his head, a gesture of dismissal visible even from a mile away, and spurred his horse on toward redemption. The moment stung, a brief, sharp reminder of the world that had rejected him. They saw a mad old man chipping at a cliff. They did not see the walls taking shape. They did not feel the growing sense of security as the wind howled outside his growing sanctuary while he remained untouched within. He began to think about the details. A place for a fire, a channel for the smoke. He found a natural fissure running up through the rock and began the painstaking process of widening it from the inside, a chimney in the making. The day finally came when he could stand fully upright inside the space he had made. The ceiling was low and uneven, the walls rough and scored with the marks of his tools, but it was a room. He stood in the center of the chamber, the air cool and still, the light from the entrance a soft, muted gray. He ran a hand along one of the walls, the stone solid and unyielding beneath his palm. It was a feeling more profound than any security a wooden frame and plank walls had ever offered him. This was a fortress of his own making, a place that could not be taken from him, could not be unwilled by a town council. That night, for the first time, he built a fire inside. Not a large, roaring blaze, but a small, carefully managed pyramid of dry brush and scavenged wood. He had spent weeks widening the fissure in the ceiling, and now he watched with a tense satisfaction as the thin ribbon of smoke wavered, then found the opening and drew cleanly upward. The fire cast flickering, dancing shadows on the stone walls, making the small space feel alive. The warmth it gave off was a luxury, a deep, penetrating heat that soothed the perpetual ache in his joints. He cooked a small portion of his dwindling cornmeal with water, the first hot meal he'd had in months. The simple, bland mush tasted like a feast. He sat with his back against the stone, the tin plate warm in his lap, and looked out the opening of his home. In the far distance, he could see the faint, scattered lights of redemption, a pale yellow smear against the encroaching darkness. There was no anger in him as he watched them, no bitterness, only a great and quiet distance. They were living in their world of wood, gossip, and commerce. He was living in his world of stone, silence, and effort. The wind picked up as the night deepened, a low, mournful sound as it swept across the prairie. But inside his cave, there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the profound stillness of the rock. He noticed the character of the wind had changed. It was no longer the dry, dusty breath of late summer. It carried a new edge, a sharp, biting cold that spoke of the high country and the snows that were beginning to gather there. Winter was coming. He felt a quiet readiness. Let it come. The first snow came not as a gentle dusting but as a sudden, violent squall that scoured the prairie with pellets of ice. It lasted only an hour, but it was a clear statement of intent from the changing season. For Abner, it was a test of his creation. He watched from the mouth of his cave as the wind tore at the landscape, whipping the dry grasses into a frenzy. The sound was a high, thin shriek, yet inside his chamber, it was muffled to a distant moan. The cold could not breach the thick stone walls. He had spent the last weeks preparing, gathering fuel with a methodical patience. Every dry branch, every gnarled root exposed by the wind, every piece of deadfall from the sparse, hardy trees that grew in the ravines was collected and stacked neatly against the far wall of his home. He had also turned his attention to food. He set simple but effective snares along the game trails at the base of the bluff, catching a handful of rabbits. He dressed them with his small knife, tanned the hides to use for patching his clothes and making cord, and smoked the meat over a slow fire, filling the cave with a rich, savory scent. He was not thriving, but he was sustaining. The work of expanding his dwelling continued, though at a slower pace. He was now carving out a second, smaller chamber off the main one, a place for storage, cool and dark. The process was the same. The patient chipping, the rhythmic strike of the hammer, the laborious removal of the rubble. But now it was done in the flickering firelight, his shadow a giant, laboring thing on the wall. He found a strange comfort in the enclosure, in the finite, knowable space he had created. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of this cave, his concerns to the sharpness of his tools, the size of his woodpile, and the state of the weather. It was a simple, elemental existence, stripped of all pretense. The complex and often cruel politics of men had been replaced by the honest and unforgiving logic of nature. The stone demanded effort, and in return it gave shelter. The wind demanded respect, and in return it revealed the locations of fallen wood. It was a bargain he understood. The blizzard arrived 3 weeks later. It did not come with the sudden fury of the first squall but with a slow, ominous gathering. The sky turned the color of lead, a low, oppressive ceiling that seemed to suck the very light from the day. Then the snow began, thick, heavy flakes falling straight down in the unnerving stillness. Abner brought his last load of wood inside and sealed the entrance not with a door, but with a heavy, dry-cured animal hide he had scavenged from a carcass months before. It was imperfect, but it blocked the worst of the wind and snow. For 3 days, the world outside ceased to exist. The wind howled, a continuous, deafening roar that vibrated through the stone itself. It was the sound of a world being torn apart. He could hear the faint, sharp cracks of tree branches snapping under the weight of the snow and ice. Inside, his fire burned steadily, its warmth a small, defiant bubble of life in the midst of the frozen chaos. He spent the time organizing his space, sharpening his tools, and mending his worn coat with a needle he'd fashioned from a sharpened bone and thread from a frayed rope. He ate sparingly, making the smoked rabbit last, the flavor a welcome change from the unending cornmeal. There were moments when the sheer, unrelenting power of the storm pressed in on him, a reminder of his own fragility. He would stand near the hide curtain, listening to the gale, and feel a profound sense of isolation. But it was not a fearful feeling. It was a clear-eyed recognition of his place in the world. A single, small man against an immense and indifferent power. Yet he was safe. He was warm. He had carved out his survival with his own 2 hands. The town of Redemption, with its wooden houses and its council of prudent men, seemed very far away, a fragile and foolish notion in the face of this elemental fury. He wondered how their neatly stacked cords of firewood were holding out, how their drafty walls were faring against a wind that could strip a man to the bone in minutes. The thought was not born of malice, but of a grim, practical curiosity. On the 4th morning, he awoke to silence, the profound, ringing quiet that follows a great storm. He pushed aside the hide curtain and was met with a wall of white. A massive drift had sealed the entrance completely. For a moment, a primal fear flickered within him, the terror of being buried alive. But it passed as quickly as it came. This was just another problem to be solved. He took up his makeshift shovel and began to dig. The snow was light and powdery, and it took less than an hour to carve a narrow channel to the outside world. When he finally emerged, he was struck breathless. The landscape was utterly transformed, a new and featureless world sculpted from snow. The drifts were immense, burying familiar rocks and shrubs, their surfaces rippled and shaped by the wind into fantastic waves and cornices. The air was so cold it felt sharp in his lungs, and the sun on the snow was blinding. He stood there for a long time, simply taking in the clean, brutal beauty of it all. Later that day, as he was clearing a wider path from his entrance, he saw movement in the distance. A single figure, struggling through the deep drifts, moving slowly toward the bluffs. The man was on foot, his horse presumably lost or abandoned. Abner watched, his hand resting on the handle of his hammer, his posture wary. Visitors were not something he had prepared for. As the figure drew closer, he recognized the man's determined, lurching gait. It was Thomas, a young rancher whose small spread bordered the town's common lands. He was known as a quiet, hard-working man who rarely spoke at town meetings. Thomas finally reached the base of the bluff, exhausted, his face chapped raw by the wind and his beard caked with ice. He looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw Abner standing in the clean-cut opening in the rock. "Abner?" he called out, his voice hoarse. "By God! We thought you were dead." Abner said nothing, simply watched as the younger man scrambled up the last few feet of the slope. Thomas stopped at the entrance, peering into the firelit darkness, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He stared at the smooth walls, the neat stack of firewood, the small chimney drawing the smoke cleanly away. He looked back at Abner, at his relatively clean clothes and the absence of frost on his eyebrows. A slow, dawning comprehension spread across his face, replacing the exhaustion. You dug this?" "I did," Abner said. His voice was rough from disuse. "You're warm," Thomas stated, the words a mixture of accusation and awe. "I am." Thomas leaned against the rock face, shaking his head slowly. "The roof of my barn collapsed. Lost 2 cows. Hemlock storefront is buried to the eaves. We've had 2 fires from people getting desperate with their stoves." He looked at Abner again, a long, searching look. I was checking my northern fence line. Got caught. Thought I was done for. Abner stepped back. A silent invitation. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before ducking inside, drawn by the irresistible pull of the warmth. He sank to the floor near the fire, holding his numb hands out to the flames, saying nothing more for a very long time. Thomas stayed for 2 days, long enough to regain his strength and for the sun to form a hard crust on the snow, making travel easier. He spoke little, but his eyes were constantly moving, taking in every detail of Abner's home. He noted the carved-out niches in the wall that served as shelves, the clever way the sleeping area was set back to avoid drafts, the sheer, mind-numbing amount of labor the place represented. When he left, his gratitude was understated but sincere. "I owe you, Abner," he said, standing at the entrance. "No one in town will believe this." Abner simply nodded. He watched Thomas make his slow, steady way back toward redemption, a small, dark figure in a vast expanse of white. A week passed. The cold held the land in an iron grip. Then, another, larger group appeared on the horizon. 3 men, making their way deliberately toward the bluff. Abner recognized the central figure immediately. It was Mr. Hemlock. The merchant was flanked by 2 other members of the town council, men who had nodded in solemn agreement when the sentence of his exile had been passed. They were dressed in heavy wool coats and thick hats, but they still looked diminished by the scale of the landscape and the biting cold. Hemlock's face, when he was close enough for Abner to see it clearly, was grim. The usual confident set of his jaw was gone, replaced by a tight, strained expression. He stopped a few yards from the entrance, his gaze sweeping over the piles of excavated limestone, dark against the snow, and the neat, impossible rectangle of the opening. He looked at Abner, who stood waiting, his arms crossed, his silence a palpable force. "Abner," Hemlock began, his tone attempting its usual authority but failing, the words thin in the cold air. "Thomas told us. We didn't credit it. And now you do," Abner said. It was not a question. One of the other men shivered violently, stamping his feet. "Another storm is coming, Abner. The trappers say it's the mother of them all. Worse than the last one. We don't have enough fuel to see it through. The green wood we're burning is filling the houses with smoke. People are getting sick." Hemlock's eyes finally met Abner's. The last of his pretense fell away, leaving the raw, ugly shape of fear. "Our reserves are gone. The town is freezing. We have women, children." He gestured vaguely at the cave. "This place, it's solid. It's warm." The unspoken question hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. The man who had declared him a burden, who had cast him out to die, was now standing at his door, asking for shelter. The situational irony was so thick Abner could almost taste it, like metallic frost on the tongue. He looked past Hemlock, toward the distant smudge that was redemption, and felt not triumph, but a great weariness. He held their desperate gazes for a long moment, the silence stretching, broken only by the crisp sound of the wind skittering across the snow. He was not a man given to speeches, and he would not give them the satisfaction of a lecture or the sting of a refusal. His response, when it came, was as practical and unadorned as the stone around him. "How many?" Hemlock blinked, taken aback by the directness of the question. "What? How many people?" Abner repeated, his voice level. "The most vulnerable. The families with young ones. The old. Perhaps 15. 20 at most." Abner's eyes scanned the interior of his home, calculating. He had the main chamber and the smaller, unfinished storage room. It would be crowded, impossibly so. But the stone was a better insulator than wood, and the body heat of 20 people would be a furnace in itself. "One fire," he said, looking back at Hemlock. "My rules. I control the fuel. Everyone brings their own blankets and what food they have. There will be no arguments. No disputes." You will tell them that relief washed over Hemlock's face, so potent it was nearly indecent. He nodded vigorously. "Of course, Abner. Anything you say. They will be grateful. I'm not interested in their gratitude," Abner said, his tone cutting. I'm interested in surviving. As are you. He turned and walked back into his cave without another word, leaving the three men standing in the cold. The message was clear. The negotiation was over. The exodus from redemption began the next morning. It was a slow, pathetic procession. They came wrapped in every piece of cloth they owned, faces pinched and blue with cold, carrying small bundles of food and bedding. The children were quiet, their usual energy stolen by the chill, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder as they approached the strange opening in the cliff. Abner watched them come, a silent observer. He saw the shame on the faces of the men, the desperate hope in the eyes of the women. They were the same people who had watched him leave, who had perhaps whispered that it was for the best. Now they came to him as their only hope. As they filed into the cave, a hushed awe fell over them. They touched the stone walls, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and reverence. They saw not a crude hole but a sanctuary. He directed them with quiet gestures, pointing the families with the smallest children toward the back wall, where it was warmest. They settled into the space, a huddled, silent mass of humanity. Hemlock was the last to enter, his wife at his side. He avoided Abner's eye, busying himself with his family's blankets. The air grew thick with the smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies, but it also grew warm. The single fire burned efficiently, its smoke drawing cleanly up the chimney. Outside, the wind began to rise again, the first harbinger of the coming storm. But inside the mountain, there was a stillness, a shared, fragile peace. Abner stood near the entrance, a sentinel at the door of the world he had built, a world that had, against all odds, become a refuge for his judges.